Mr. Speaker, we have failed fundamentally because we have not been able to understand the type of inflation, and I mean the managers of the economy have not really understood the kind of inflation that we've been dealing with, especially in the last 5 years. Mr. Speaker, inflation comes by many ways, and the old textbook methodology of dealing with inflation has changed in the modern days of modern economics. Mr. Speaker, inflation traditionally or originally used to be a demand-driven, and that is why this arrangement between interest rate and inflation or policy rate were actually put in place, because you can then use your money supply, which is basically what interest rate is, to take money out of the system or put it in, depending on the heat that your economy is generating as a result of inflation. But when you have inflation coming from different places other than the traditional demand inflation, which is what happens to us during the COVID period, when we have supply chain disruptions, where our inflation was coming from supply side, demand side, and also the exchange rate, then it is difficult to use monetary policy to address that problem. What the central bank did in 2020, which in my opinion was a mistake, was to try and resolve inflation by trying to deal with both the demand side and the supply side, and not allowing the Ministry of Finance, who is responsible for the supply side, because the supply side was physical, actually left the space for the central bank to do that. And central bank ended up pumping money to address a problem that had nothing to do with them. It was a bad prescription given to a sickness they had no idea what is sickness. And that is what caused us the problem that we're in. Historically, we've had a problem with interest rate or policy rate not exactly being proportional as the traditional arrangement in textbook, that normally your interest rate is proportional to your inflation. Therefore, whichever direction your inflation is moving, that is where your interest rate will also move to be able to address it. But when you have a situation where your inflation is really becoming exponential, but your policy rate is not dealing with it, then the problem is more than demand side. We had a serious challenge side problem. My brother Doc mentioned about the United States system. When you have the Treasury addressing inflation, they do their bit. You can still see inflation going up, no matter what the Treasury is doing, or no matter what the Federal Reserve is doing. It's because that the Fed are doing their bit, and the Treasury should also do their bit. In the last 5 years in Ghana, the central bank got it completely wrong in doing monetary policy and fiscal policy all in monetary policy. And they got it absolutely wrong. And that is why we ended up with so much money being spent by the central bank. Normally, how will central bank end up in debt? It's unimaginable that your central bank, which is the bank of last resort, actually is losing money and has no one to bail it out, because they were using money to solve a problem that should have been done by the fiscal side. And that is what we got into a mess. And that conversation is a serious one that we need to begin to look at. Exactly, is inflation targeting still a thing to do? And in my opinion, no. Because you cannot target inflation with monetary policy any longer. You will have to look at where the inflation is actually coming from and use all the tools available to you, the monetary policy, the fiscal policy. How do you deal with inflation when it's coming from your exchange rate? Because exchange rate has inflation. If your currency is depreciating, it means that the component of of inflation in your exchange rate will also be going up, and that will feed. And if you are using monetary policy to try and address those problems, we are always going to get it wrong. So it's about time we need to sit down and rethink. Our central bank need to rethink about how they use monetary policy to try and address inflation. And I must commend the maker of the statement for bringing something that I believe in the next few years will basically begin to change economics the way we think about it here in Ghana, because it has moved from the old economics to a modern day economics, which the managers of the economy don't seem to have grasped the fundamentals of it. Mr. Speaker, with these few words, I will end here. Thank you.